You want to finish what you started? You came to the right place. Them girls that you came with, you might have to part with. Depending on how this thing shakes. Wauwatosa, Kenosha, is in the house.
All right, welcome to another episode of The New Look, a special episode of The New Look, where we're going to be taking a new look at a lot of things: lobsters, cybersecurity, the connections between Maine and Wisconsin. And let me just say at the outset, I will admit my favorite member of Congress is not a Republican. My favorite member of Congress is not a Democrat. My favorite member is an independent from Maine, Senator Angus King. How are you, sir?
I'm great, Mike. Great to join you, man. This is terrific.
This is fun. We really appreciate it. And before we get into the nature of our collaboration over the last year, I've been lucky to have a lot of conversations with you and learn about your background, which I think is really interesting and significant. So I don't really know where to begin this story.
Well, the place to begin is that my wife is from Milwaukee and is a certified cheesehead and a part owner of the Green Bay Packers. I mean, what's not to like about that?
So how did this happen? How did you find yourself married to a Packers fan?
Well, she grew up in Milwaukee and then went to Northwestern and then came east, taught school in Washington, D.C., and then ended up being married to a guy in Maine, not me. Came to Maine in the early 70s, and then we met in the 80s, and both of us had former marriages. We refer to them as our practice marriages. And we've just had a wonderful relationship. But she grew up on the east side of Milwaukee near the lake and is just a fanatic Packer fan. I mean, you should see her on Sundays she's got overalls, shoes, green and yellow shoes, a cheese head. But she tells me that the best present I ever gave her for her birthday was 2 shares of stock in the Packers, which, as you know, convey absolutely no rights to anything, but it's proudly framed right above the TV. And every Sunday during the fall, and I hope this fall, we watch the Packers. She's even got me, all involved in Aaron Rodgers and the fate of the Packers. It's really fun. We went up to Lambeau. We came to Green Bay a couple of years ago, stayed with Reed Ribble, your predecessor. And I had gotten to know Reed, and we stayed with him, went to a night Packer game. They played the Seahawks. And I took a panoramic picture of Lambeau from up in this, the upper stands where we were, had it blown up, and it hangs above our bed at home. So the Packers are a big part of this little family in Maine.
So you sleep under just the presence of Lambeau Field.
Exactly. And it's a kind of reassuring. No, and Mary remembers as a kid going to Packers games in County Stadium in Milwaukee. Apparently there was a time when they used to play a couple of games a year down in Milwaukee. I guess they don't do that anymore, but she remembers going to Packers game, and she also grew up going to the Brewers, first the Braves and then the Brewers. She was a big Hank Aaron fan from when the Braves were in Milwaukee.
Well, you married very well. You outkicked your coverage, as the saying.
No question. I married up, man. There's no doubt about that. Anybody that knows the two of us will tell you that.
Okay, so I want to get into your deep love of Maine and your origin story in Maine, but I wonder if it's worth starting before that with your father, who, having heard you tell many stories about him, just seems like a very fascinating guy. I sort of imagine him as this Atticus Finch figure in my mind.
Well, sort of that he had that in him. I grew up in Alexandria, Virginia, right across the river from Washington. Went to high school there, a big public high school. Both my parents had been public school teachers, and then my dad went to law school at night in the 30s and practiced law in Alexandria. And there's sort of a couple of stories about him. Number one, about the time I was starting high school was the time of integration of the schools. The Brown versus Board of Education decision was in 1954. And in 1959, my high school was one of the first schools in Virginia to integrate 2 black kids in a school of 1,400. I mean, talk about courage. Those 2 kids, they were brother and sister, Jimmy and Patsy Ragland. They were great young people, and just think about being the only 2 in a school of that size in 1959. Anyway, Virginia went through this period of fighting integration, and they passed a whole series of laws. They called it massive resistance. That was the characterization. That's what they called it themselves. And one of the laws was that if a black child crossed over the threshold of a white school, at that moment, that school was automatically by law closed. And there were school districts in Virginia that had no public schools for years, 5 or 6, 7 years. And the white kids, they started what they called segregation academies, where they went to school in the basement of the churches. They were essentially private schools. But that's sort of, my father wasn't a great activist. He wasn't a big liberal or anything, but he really deeply believed in public schools. And that just tore it for him. And he formed a group in Northern Virginia, or worked with a group called SOS, Save Our Schools. He went down to Richmond, lobbied to change those laws, and got engaged. And it cost him. I mean, it cost him clients. It cost him business. But his feeling was, if that was the kind of business, he didn't need it. But the really amazing story about him occurred in the early 50s, which was the time of, I hate to say this, a guy from Wisconsin named Joe McCarthy. And it was, you know what that period was like, and people were sort of afraid of their own shadow, and they were afraid of who they associated with and everything. Anyway, he was at the courthouse in Arlington, Virginia, on what's called a motion day, which is the day that they have a whole series of motions. There are no trials, but the judge is deciding all these different things. So there are a whole bunch of lawyers there. In the middle of this afternoon, the 2 U.S. Marshals walked in with a guy in handcuffs who was a communist who had been arrested for handing out communist literature at the Pentagon. And the judge examined him, determined that he was indigent and therefore entitled to representation. And he looked out at this room full of lawyers and said, "Who's going to represent this guy?" And of course, again, it's 1951. Everybody's sort of looking in their pockets, and they're shuffling their papers, to avoid eye contact. And Dad put his hand up and said, if he needs representation, I'll take care of him. I don't know what happened. I think he pled him guilty and paid a $100 fine or something. That was the end of it. So a year or 2 later, that same judge, there was a position that came open in the federal court system called it was called U.S. Commissioner. And it was like an assistant federal judge that handled minor offenses. That job came open, and the federal judge had the appointment for that job. He was then sitting down in Norfolk, Virginia. His clerk went to him and said, "Who do you want to appoint in Northern Virginia to this U.S. Commissioner job?" The judge said, "I don't know any lawyers up there. Find the guy who had the guts to take the communist."
Wow.
And that's how Dad became a U.S. Commissioner and later a federal magistrate. And it was sort of typical of him. I mean, he just was quietly principled and honest, and he wasn't a loud activist or anything, but that's the kind of guy he was, and I've tried to live up to that.
So for him, do you think that was kind of a John Adams defending British soldiers thing? Just everyone's entitled to some form of defense, and
yeah. And I never really talked to him about it and what went through his mind, but I don't think he did a calculation. I just think he said, this guy is entitled to representation, and I'm here, and I'll take care of it.
So what was a young Angus King like, and did your dad's demeanor and intelligence rub off on you? What were you like as a young student?
I was a pretty serious.
At any point?
I was a pretty serious student in high school. I went through, elementary school, Douglas MacArthur School in Alexandria, Virginia, and then Francis C. Hammond High School. My high school, by the way, was the predecessor of T.C. Williams. Remember the Titans?
Oh,
the film Remember the Titans? Coach Yost, the white coach in Remember the Titans, was a coach on the football staff when I played football at Hammond. Coach Yost was a coach. I've known Bill Yost. He just died about a year and a half ago. I've known him for 50 years. Wonderful guy. And then my high school, there were 3 high schools in Alexandria when I was in school. There were 2 white high schools and 1 black high school. And when they finally got around to being serious about integration, the problem was the black people lived in one geographic area, more or less. And so if they just had integrated, one of the white high schools would have been mostly black and the other one would have been mostly white. And the school board, I think somewhat ingeniously, decided to close all 3 high schools and open a new one for the whole city, T.C. Williams. And that was the origin of T.C. Williams in 1968. And the beginning of Remember the Titans, you'll see guys with Hammond T-shirts on. And that was the integration of the football team that won the state championship, I think, in 71. Now, the good news for me is I love playing high school football. If I'd gone to T.C. Williams, I wouldn't have probably made the team. See, there were 3 teams, and all of a sudden there was 1. And so I don't think I would have been good enough to play on that team. We had our team my senior year wasn't very good. Our record was 1-8-1, 1 win, 8 losses, 1 tie. Our team motto was "We're small but we're slow." That was it. But it was a great experience for me. And then T.C. Williams came along and is still a major high school in Northern Virginia. So anyway, I went to public school. Both my parents, as I mentioned, had been teachers in the 30s. In fact, they both worked their way through college. My parents were the first members of their family to go to college in 1,000 years. I think maybe there was one member of my mother's family that may have gone in 1700 or something. But anyway, they worked their way through college. They both were high school teachers when they got out. My mom was very demanding. I think she always carried a red pencil with her. Anything I wrote, and here's a good this is a true political story. I think I was running for 7th grade class president, and I wrote out my little speech and gave it to Mom. She looked at it. She went and got her red pencil and circled one word that was repeated throughout the speech. The word was "I." And she said, they want to know what you're going to do for them, they don't want to hear about I, they want to hear about them. I think that's pretty good political advice to a 7th grader. I'll never forget that I. She circled I. It was like 20 times. It was pretty embarrassing.
It also reminds me of A River Runs Through It when the dad, who's a preacher, keeps, crossing out all of their writing assignments and telling them to come back until it's much shorter. So
yeah.
You had great role models. So how did Dartmouth get on your radar, and did you go to college having a sense of what you wanted to do?
No, the Dartmouth is a great story because I often talk to kids, young high school kids agonize about college, and they agonize about the decision, and they go all these college visits and they go online and everything. My story is completely different. The summer between my junior and senior year in high school, my sister married a guy from Dartmouth, and I liked the people at the wedding. Done. That was it. I applied. I'd never been up there. I did no college tour whatsoever. I applied early decision, got in, and the first time I ever saw it was when I went up to enroll in September of 1962. But in retrospect, meeting 10 or 12 graduates of the college over a course of 3 or 4 days is probably not a terrible way to make that decision. It's probably just as good as seeing what the buildings look like. So that was easy. I mean, I don't think I'd even heard of Dartmouth before. As I say, it was the only place I applied. I had a great experience there. It was all male at the time, except for me, because while I was there, I started dating a young woman from Hanover High School, who I ultimately married. My former wife, Edie, with whom I'm very good friends to this day. And I met her. She was, I'm embarrassed to say, I was 19 and she was 16.
It was a different time.
Yeah, it sure was. 5 years later, we were married.
Was there a D plan back then? Dartmouth is famous for its D plan.
No, that started the Dartmouth plan where they rotate and everybody goes in one summer. That started, it was actually ingenious. When Dartmouth went co-ed in the 70s after I left, they immediately admitted, an extra 1,500 students. And they were faced with having to build a whole bunch of new dorms and new eating facilities and everything. But somebody came up with this idea of dividing the year into 4 quarters, and you sort of rotated, and all sophomores go for the summer term and other people go for the summer term. So the net result is you have more students but the same physical plant. So they didn't have to really expand the physical plant very much. It was a pretty smart move. The disadvantage that I've heard is that it impairs relationships, friendships, because you never know when your best friend is going to be off for a term.
Sure.
And if they're off for a term and then you're off for a term, you may not see them for 6 or 8 months, and so it sort of complicates that. But it certainly worked from the point of view of what the college was trying to achieve, which was to expand enrollment without spending $1 zillion for new dorms.
So what did you study as an undergrad, and remind me when does Maine enter the picture?
Maine's not in the picture yet. I think when I was at Dartmouth, I probably assumed I was going to go back to Virginia. And I should have said, as a kid growing up in Alexandria, which is right across the river from Washington, and getting the Washington Post every morning, our dinner table discussion was mostly politics. Some families it's sports and some families it's business. And, I didn't know what the prime rate was, but I knew that, Richard Nixon wasn't a great guy. At least that was what I learned from my parents. They were sort of old New Deal Democrats, Franklin D. Roosevelt. So politics was sort of in my head. I mentioned I ran for president of the 7th grade. I was president of the student council at the high school. And I always thought maybe I'd go into politics. But then as I got older and got married and had children, it sort of got further and further away. And I really sort of gave up on the idea, to be honest, in my 40s. I ended up running for public office at the age of 50. That was my first venture into running for public office. And I ran for governor of Maine and won as an independent. That's a different story. But so it was sort of like, I don't think politics is going to work for me. And then all of a sudden things opened up and the opportunity came and I did that. So anyway, Dartmouth, I did study government. That was my major, but I wish if I had it to do over again, it would have been history. I took a fair amount of history. Somebody asked me about my job. They say, what's a U.S. senator's job? And I said, it's applied history with a minor in communications. That's really what we do. That's what we're doing. So I graduated from Virginia Law School, Dartmouth, and went to Virginia Law School. Again, assuming I'd go home to Virginia. That was my home state. I applied to Yale Law School and didn't get in. And that was the best day of my father's life, because Virginia Law School at the time was $700 a semester for a state student. I don't know what Yale was, but it was a hell of a lot more. And I had a meeting here in Washington a couple of years ago with there was a whole room full of Yale graduates, like 500 or 100 or, a whole bunch of people. And I started by saying, I owe my whatever success I've achieved in life to Yale. Pause. They all looked sort of puzzled. We didn't know I went to. I said, yeah, when Yale Law School rejected me, I decided I would dedicate the rest of my life to making them regret the decision. So anyway, rejected from Yale, went to the University of Virginia Law School. And when I worked in legal aid there a little bit. And when I finished, I applied to the National Legal Services Program, which was part of Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. And they had a national piece of that. So I applied in my third year of law school, got accepted, and the fellow called me up in the spring of my third year and said, Mr. King, you've been accepted in the program. You have three choices. We will send you either to the Rosebud Sioux Indian Reservation in South Dakota, Alexandria, Louisiana, or Pine Tree Legal Assistance in Maine. And I remember, this is how our lives change, because of random
sliding door
things.
here or there. Yeah.
You just don't know where it's all going to lead. And I said, well, I don't speak much Sioux, and I grew up in the South, and I really don't want to do that right now. So I guess that leaves Maine. And in August of 1969, I moved to Maine and was assigned there to a little town in Maine called Skowhegan, which is in a rural area, small town, very tough economically, about, I don't know, 100 miles from Portland, I guess. I'd never set foot in Maine before. And so that was how I happened to go to Maine. Now here's a really fascinating piece about that story. The guy who ended up in the job at the Sioux Indian Reservation ended up governor of South Dakota. How about that? That's sort of weird, isn't it?
What happened to the guy who went to Alexandria?
I haven't tracked that person down. But so anyway, that's how I happened to go to Maine, and except for 2 years working, 2.5 years working down here in the Senate, have been in Maine ever since, 50 years, and I've done everything from lawyering to business to media, governor, Could
you explain a little bit about the media aspect of that? Because you were on public television in Maine prior to running for governor. What was that like? Well,
I again, it's one of those random things. There was a guy who was a friend of mine who had a talk show on public broadcasting in Maine. It was like, Washington Week in Review, where you have a Bob Costa is the host and Robert Costa is the host, and then they're journalists. We had a copy of that show. So my friend was the host. He came to my office when I just come back from working in the Senate, and said, I'm getting married. I have to be away for 2 weeks. How about hosting my show? And I said, geez, I've never done anything like that before. I don't even know how to start. He said, well, they'll pay you $25 a show. I had just opened my law practice, and in the prior month had grossed $100. So $25 a show sounded like real money. That was 50% of my prior month gross. So I said, okay. So I did it for a couple of weeks. My friend came back, and then he left the show to run for Congress. He wasn't elected, but he left. So the director called me, or the producer called me and said, well, you did okay back in September. Why don't you take over this show? And basically I did it for 15 years. The show morphed into different, later on, instead of copying Washington Week in Review, we copied the McNeil-Lehrer News Hour. But it was essentially a weekly talk show where I would interview mostly politicians, and on some issue of the day, something going on in Maine, whatever it was, something in the legislature or a drought or whatever it was. And somebody once said, well, how did you decide after doing that? Oh, I also moderated debates. I moderated debate for Bill Cohen, who was running for the Senate, and David Emory and George Mitchell. Interviewed George Mitchell a bunch of times. And somebody said, well, why'd you decide to run? I said, because for 15 years, I've been asking questions, and finally I realized my questions are better than their answers. So I'm going to try it. Why not? So anyway, but here's a funny story, Mike. I'm 15 years on public broadcasting. So I have a poll taken to decide whether to run for governor. The poll comes back now.
Mid-90s?
This was 93, running in 94. So I do the poll. My good friend Kay Rand, my campaign manager and later chief of staff, she claims my name recognition was 9%. I believe it was 11%. But whatever it was, it wasn't much. But I used to say, okay, so I don't have a big audience, but it's a quality audience.
Dedicated.
And when I first started running, I was speaking to the Biddeford Rotary Club. I made a speech about Maine and, what we had to do to get out of the economic problems we were in. And a guy came up to me afterwards. He said, "I've been watching you on TV for years. I never knew you had ideas before." I thought, oh, okay, there you go.
That's
So
great.
anyway, yeah, but the TV stuff was always part-time.
Okay.
During that period, I was practicing law, and then I left law practice, went to work for a small company that developed alternative energy projects. This is in the early 80s, hydropower, wood, biomass. You guys have that. And then started my own company that did large-scale energy conservation projects. We would change all the light fixtures in a paper mill to save electricity, or pumps, or big projects, paper mills, colleges, hospitals. It turned out it was a new idea. It had never been done the way I proposed to do it, and it was wildly successful. Wow. And I started it, borrowed a lot of money. I remember walking away from the bank and saying, if my father were alive and knew how much money I just borrowed, he'd die. He was brought up in the Depression, couldn't, always worried about borrowing money. The company was successful. I sold it in January of '94 and was elected governor that November, partially on the basis of money that I put in myself. Mary once calculated how much money I spent in order to be called a jerk on the front page of the newspaper.
Can I take one step back, because you were a staffer in Congress? Who did you work for, and what was kind of your impression of the institution when you worked there?
I worked for a guy named Bill Hathaway, who was a Democratic senator from Maine who defeated Margaret Chase Smith in 1972, and he in turn was defeated by Bill Cohen in 1978. He only served one term. He'd been in the House. He was in the House, I think, 6 years. I think he was elected in the Goldwater landslide. Okay. So he was in the House 8 years, from 64 to 72, and then was in the Senate for a term. Wonderful, wonderful guy. And I was on his committee staff. I was the chief counsel of the Railroad Retirement Subcommittee of the Senate Committee on Labor and Public Welfare. And the only claim to fame was that was the subcommittee that freshman Democratic senators were assigned to if they were in the majority. And my claim to fame was that a young freshman Democratic senator in like 1950 had that subcommittee. His name was Jack Kennedy, and his aide that had my job was Ted Sorensen. So, what can I say? So anyway, yeah, I was here. It was during Watergate, Mike.
Oh,
it was
wow.
Exactly the period. I started my Senate service January of '73, which was right after Nixon's election in '72, and Watergate unfolded over the next year. And of course, Nixon resigned in August of '74. The dumb thing for me was I worked in the Russell Senate office building. I never went to one day of the Irvin Committee hearings, which I should have. I look back on that and really regret it, not having at least had that experience. But and you ask what the difference was, and I think this is significant. The biggest difference that I've seen is that in those days, everybody lived in Washington. Mm. The work week was a 5-day week. And as you know, now the schedule is the first vote is Monday afternoon and the last vote is Thursday afternoon. So everybody goes home. My friend Brian Schatz, a senator from Hawaii, goes home every weekend. Oregon, Ohio, New York, Maine, except until the COVID, I don't like to fly, so I stay here now for longer periods. But what that means is we don't know each other. We don't have relationships. In those days, they all hung out, and their families knew each other. They went to ball games together. Their families lived here. Bill Hathaway lived in McLean. Ed Muskie lived in Chevy Chase. Their kids grew up here. But now, families back home. My wife Mary's in Maine. She's not down here. The result of that is a a lack of relationships. And from relationships come trust. And from trust comes the ability to accomplish things, particularly in a contentious way. The other difference that I've noticed is, and I'm not so totally confident of my history here, but the speaker and the majority leader in those days didn't have the kind of power that they do today. The majority leader when I was here was a guy named Mike Mansfield from Montana. And I've always thought of him as he sort of kept the trains running. But he didn't have the kind of power that Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell had of blocking everything. If they don't want a bill to come to the floor, it doesn't come up. And if they can write a bill in their office and bring it up without taking it to a committee, my constituents are amazed at the power that Mitch McConnell has. I mean, he has total control over what goes on the floor of the U.S. Senate. And as you know, the House has passed 300 or 400 bills in the last 8 months that are just sitting on his desk that he just doesn't want to bring up. In those days, it was much more collegial. It was also more mixed in terms of ideology. Mm-hmm. There were 15 or 20 very conservative Democrats and 15 or 20 very liberal Republicans. Jacob Javits was a Republican from New York. He was probably the most liberal guy in the whole place. Mark Hatfield, Edward Brooke of Massachusetts were, you don't hear that term liberal Republican much anymore. And then there was the Southern Democrats, Stennis of Mississippi and Byrd of Virginia. I mean, they were very conservative and much more conservative but now there's no overlap. Mm-hmm. Joe Manchin is probably the most conservative member of the Democratic caucus, and Susan Collins probably the most moderate member of the Republican caucus. But if you look at their voting records, there's still air between them. And that's a big difference. And the inability, that's why when, you and I have dinner together once a week when we can, and it's why if you got to really actively try to develop relationships. Otherwise, it's no wonder the place doesn't work very well.
Well, I agree with everything you said. And I wonder did you sense that? Well, maybe let me say, ironically, I think your history is correct. And it was a lot of the Watergate babies in the 70s who came in on a reform agenda and actually kind of opened Pandora's box a little bit that led to this. And then Republicans intensified it in the 90s with reforms. Right. Where power is now really consolidated at the top, which I think is unfortunate. Did you sense some of this at the state level too when you ran for governor? And was that part of why you ran as an independent? Because I can't imagine that prior to you doing it, anyone thought it could be done.
Well, actually, it could be done because it was done. Oh. And that enabled me to win. We had an independent governor in Maine elected in 1974. A guy named Jim Longley. He was a businessman. In fact, one of the people he beat was none other than George Mitchell, who went on to be a great senator and majority leader and, just an all-around hero. But anyway, Jim Longley won. So when I ran as an independent, it was thinkable. The hard part of running as an independent is to convince voters that they're not wasting their vote. That it's not a fool's errand, that you're not some kind of flake. And so the fact that there has been a generally well thought of by the population independent governor at least made me be considered. At the time, I'd been a business guy, and although I was raised as a Democrat, but when my period of public television, I couldn't be a partisan. I mean, I was a neutral journalist. As I say, I moderated debates. Nobody ever questioned my partisanship because I just wasn't active. So when it came time to run, there were two factors. One was ideology. I was uncomfortable with what I felt was a democratic over-reliance on regulation and taxation. Remember, I was a business guy. Mm-hmm. And yet I was also uncomfortable with, even then, the Republican Party's reluctance on issues like abortion and gay rights, social issues. So I was fiscally conservative, socially liberal. That didn't give me a home in either place. the other reality was that the guy who was running for governor as a Democrat that year was unbeatable in a Democratic primary. He'd been governor twice, he'd been congressman twice, he'd been attorney general, he had 94% name recognition. So if I wanted a pathway to be governor, it wasn't going to be through a Democratic primary. So I ran as an independent, both because I felt more comfortable, but also for practical reasons. And I'll tell you, Mike, it worked. It was a luxury as a governor. Although I had no team in the legislature, I had no ready-made. I used to say I have no automatic enemies, no automatic friends. I've got 186 skeptics. And I had to build coalitions one issue at a time. And there were times when I sided with the Republicans, and there were times when I sided with the Democrats. But the other piece that was an advantage for an executive is that it's the practice in our country that if you're a president or a governor if you're a Democrat, say, or a Republican, your cabinet, your appointments, all your people are of your party. Usually a president will appoint one, token member of the other party. Obama had, I think, a guy named Ray LaHood, a Republican congressman who was Secretary of Transportation. I can't think if President Trump has any Democrats, but by and large, it's all your party. Well, if you think about that, 1/3 of the country are Democrats, 1/3 of the country are Republicans, and about the other 40% are unenrolled. They're independents. They're neither party. So let's say you're elected governor and you choose from your own party, you've eliminated 2/3 of the talent pool. You see what I'm saying? Mm. And as governor, I could appoint anybody. In fact, I had a really funny experience. I was at a national governors meeting once, and these fellows were talking about appointing judges. And it was at a reception or something, and I sort of sidled over and listened. And one guy said, well, I get the list from the Republican City Committee, and then they say, you choose who you want. And the other guy said, well, the Democratic State Committee gives me the list of prospective judges, and I pick them. And they saw me and knew I was an independent. They said, how do you do it? And I said, well, I just picked the best qualified lawyers I could find to be judges. And the guy said, you do? I mean, what a crazy idea. So, I felt that was actually an advantage. And when I came down here as an independent, I didn't know how it was going to work in a body that's organized in this way. I had to choose one caucus or the other. I had this fantasy of putting my chair in the middle of the aisle, just really independent. But then I found out the party caucus is how you get your committee assignments.
Oh, interesting. So if you hadn't caucused with the Democrats, or the Republicans, you wouldn't have committee assignments.
Most likely, I'd be a semi-pariah that wouldn't, and if you're not on a committee, that's three-quarters of the work around here. So I had to choose. The Democrats were more active in courting me. The Republicans reached out, but it wasn't as aggressive, to be honest. And I went in and talked to Harry Reid, and I said, look, my major concern is I want to be left alone. I mean, I don't want to be pressured. don't have to sign anything in blood or make any promises. And he agreed to that. And I can honestly say in 4 years with Harry as the leader, he only asked me for 2 votes. And one of them, I said no. And the other one, I was going to vote with him anyway. But so he respected my independence. Now, some of your viewers are going to say, well, I know this guy. He votes with the Democrats most of the time. That's true, particularly as the Republican Party has moved to the right. I sort of feel like I'm where I was in 1995, but the world has sort of shifted around me. The Democrats have moved to the left and the Republicans have moved to the right. There was a comedian in the 50s, he was the 50s version of Jon Stewart, a guy named Mort Saul. And he once said, if you maintain a consistent political opinion in this country, you will eventually be tried for treason. And, I sometimes feel that way.
I was going to ask you why we don't see more independent governors and senators, but I want to go back to something So I find this interesting that, you were able to do this in Maine in part because it had been done before. And I actually think what connects Maine to Wisconsin more than your wife's sports affiliations is this shared kind of independent impulse. And, you mentioned McCarthy, but Margaret Chase Smith, you also mentioned, is famous for denouncing McCarthy and got blowback. Right. McCarthy, I would argue, is the exception that proves the rule in Wisconsin. All of our most prominent politicians have been unorthodox. I mean, Wisconsin's the birthplace of the Republican progressive movement.
And wasn't Proxmire from Wisconsin?
Proxmire is a perfect example of
talk about a character.
Yeah, I mean, a Democrat inveighing against waste in Washington, not spending any money on his campaigns. Gaylord Nelson, and obviously Bob LaFollette being probably the best example, the only person resisting, our entry into World War I. But I wonder why that is. I don't really have a coherent explanation for it. Is it in the water? Is it in the beer? What's the? Maybe I'm inventing a connection that doesn't exist.
No. I think there is something to that, and I thought a lot about that in Maine. Here's part of my theory, and it may apply to Wisconsin as well. Maine is geographically isolated. It's on the top of the country, and the original settlers of Maine, after the native people, the indigenous people, but the original European settlers were farmers, foresters, and fishermen. And if you think of those are all pretty solitary pursuits. They're all things you do independently. And I think that sort of seeped into the culture because our great political leaders, Margaret Chase Smith was a Republican, but she was never in the in crowd of the Republican leaders in the Senate. She was always viewed a little suspiciously. She took on McCarthy, as you recall. Ed Muskie was a Democrat, but he was certainly a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat, but he had a kind of personal integrity that transcended partisanship. Also, I think a state where it's a state made up of smaller towns, and people know one another, and they have a sense of community, and they're reluctant to label other people. And I think Wisconsin has some of that. Wisconsin has the forests and the lake and farming certainly. And I think it goes back to the culture of the place 100 plus years ago, and it carries through.
Wow, I never thought about it in those terms, but I think you're definitely onto something. Well, so you do 2 terms as an independent governor of Maine. When you left office, well, one, what were the big takeaways from your experience? And 2, did you ever think at that moment that you'd be back in politics at some point?
No, I can tell you assuredly, I was absolutely done with politics. In fact, when I ran for governor, I used to say, I'm going to run for governor once, maybe twice, and then I'm done. And I absolutely meant that. I had no intention of running. People used to say, our 2 senators were Susan Collins and Olympia Snowe, and people used to say, well, why don't you run for the Senate? And I said, well, because, if I did, it would just be an ego trip. Susan and Olympia have been there for a while, and why should I do that? And then all of a sudden, in late February, I think the very last day of February in 2012, Olympia Snowe quit. To everyone's surprise. I mean, everyone figured she was a shoo-in for re-election, and she announced she was leaving the Senate. And it was what she said that provoked me to run. If she had said, I'm leaving, I'm not going to run for re-election this year because I want to spend more time with my family, or I want to travel, or whatever. What she said was, the place doesn't work. It's hopelessly partisan. We can't get anything done. The atmosphere is bad, and I'm leaving. And I thought, well, okay, I'm an independent. Maybe I can play a role in helping to make it work. Maybe I can act somewhat as a bridge and try to find ways to bring people together. Maybe that was naive, but at that point I said, gee, I think this is something that maybe I should try. Mike, when I was about, I don't know, in my early 20s, I got a piece of advice from an old man in New Hampshire. that is the most significant piece of advice I've had in my whole life, and it's absolutely determined my decision at some key turning points, one of which was March of 2012. The old man said this. He said, when you get to be my age, you're going to regret things about your life. See that you regret the things you did and not the things you didn't do.
Wow.
That's a profound piece of advice.
I love
And
that.
I like to think about decisions by casting my mind ahead 5 or 10 years and say, how will this decision look looking back on it? And I didn't want to look back and say, maybe you could have helped the U.S. Senate. Maybe you could have done something important for the country, but you didn't try. I didn't want to do that. So that was the nub of my decision to run for the Senate. And I'll tell you, Mike, it was wonderful because the campaign was 8 months long. You know, I announced in the first week of March, and the election was the first week of November. And you know, as you know, we're now in the world of endless campaigns, and that was a great experience.
Wow.
So,
so can I? So you come to the Senate in 2012.
Yeah, I was elected in 12, sworn in 13. 40 years to the day from the day I entered Senate service as a staff member.
I think most people would expect a former two-term governor from Maine to focus, you know, mostly on and with your background, environmental issues or meat and potatoes issues. I wouldn't naturally assume that national security would have been a passion for you. So talk to me about how you got involved in that and on the Armed Services Committee and the Intel Committee.
Well, Maine has had a senator on the Armed Services Committee without a break, except for the Bill Hathaway 6 years. He wasn't on the committee. Other than that, Maine has had a senator on the Armed Services Committee for like 60 years, 70 years. Margaret Chase Smith. That was her platform, was the Armed Services Committee. And so all the way through the 50s, the 60s, most of the 70s, Bill Cohen, of course, was on the Armed Services Committee. He ended up being Secretary of Defense. So, and we have some major military facilities in Maine. We have Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, Bath Iron Works that build ships. And, you know, it's an important part of Maine's history. And at the time, you know, I remember Susan Collins had been on the committee and she was leaving, and she texted me and said, I'm leaving. Maine needs somebody on the committee. You should apply. So I went to Harry Reid and Chuck Schumer, and they said, what do you want for committee assignments? I said, the only one I really want is Armed Services. You can put me wherever else you want, you know, to fill in wherever you think it would work. So I ended up, my initial assignment was Armed Services and Intelligence, and then Budget and Rules. I later left Budget, and now I'm on Energy and Natural Resources, which does play into my history as an entrepreneur in alternative energy and also the out of doors. I'm the ranking member of the National Park Subcommittee, and that's a big public land conservation was a big deal for me, as both before I was governor, during governor, and since. So the Energy and Natural Resources really fits. The Armed Services,
because you toured the country in an RV.
Oh yeah. Well, that was the day I left office as governor. My wife and I and our 2 kids, who were then 12 and 9, took off in a 40-foot RV towing a car and did a 5.5-month, 15,000-mile, 33-state circumnavigation of the U.S. It was probably the greatest experience of my life. I think we went to 17 national parks, state parks, you know, Walmart parking lots, you name it. And I'm trying to think. We crossed through Wisconsin. No, as a matter of fact, we went to Duluth and then up and ended up going through Canada. We wanted to avoid the Chicago traffic and came down through Montreal and into Vermont. So, but of course I've been to Wisconsin many, many times. But we had an absolutely amazing trip, and it was just. You know, just an incredible experience. And my wife and I fell in love with RVing. We just bought a new RV 2 weeks ago from a company in Indiana, a dealer in Maine, and we're already planning trips for this fall while you're running for re-election and I'm not. Sorry about that.
How dare you bring that up? Okay, so in your work on the on Armed Services Committee, Intel Committee, you obviously became acquainted with the issue of cybersecurity. Maybe talk a little bit about that, and then how you got appointed to the Cyberspace Solarium Commission.
We have had, I don't know, 25 or 30 hearings in one or the other of those committees over the past 5 or 6 years that have talked about cyber and have talked about how serious it is, how serious the risk is, how dangerous it is, and how ill prepared we are. And I had a sort of standard line of questions. In fact, I've decided in the Armed Services Committee we should have Armed Services Committee bingo, because certain senators always ask the same questions. And I'm not going to embarrass them by telling, but one of King has 2 standard questions. What is, will you tell the truth to power if you're going to be the head of the CIA or whatever it is, the Secretary of Defense? And the second is, why don't we have a policy to tell our adversaries in cyberspace that if they whack us, they're going to get whacked back? It never made common sense to me that there was no deterrent. And this was something I really got into, particularly on the Intelligence Committee, because I started to learn and realize how serious the threat is. In fact, if you were betting, there's a much higher likelihood of a serious cyber confrontation than there is a shooting war, or a combination of both. So anyway, it's something I've been very interested in. I wasn't the initiator, though. Ben Sass, who was also on the Armed Services Committee, Republican senator from Nebraska, put into the Armed Services Bill, the National Defense Act in 2019, a provision creating this Cyber Solarium Commission. And then it passed, it became law, and Ben came to me and said, I think you should why don't you ask Chuck Schumer to appoint you, and I'll get Mitch to appoint me. And I went to Chuck, and that's how I happened to be on it. And you talked to Paul Ryan, I think, and Jim Langevin probably talked to Nancy Pelosi, and here we are. I don't have a clear memory of how you and I became chairs. I think we somehow self-appointed, but anyway. Here we
I think I blocked it out of my memory.
Yeah, right. I don't know. It's something about a coup d'etat. I don't know. Nobody else was at the meeting.
Well, you're also a huge proponent of organizational reform, and maybe share a little bit about your views on the need to have kind of single points of responsibility in the federal government.
Well, years ago, a friend said this to me. He said, Napoleon said war is history. Freud said, anatomy is destiny. My friend said, structure is policy. If you have a messy structure, a messy organization, you'll have messy policy. And I think there's a lot to that. And one of the problems with cyber, which you and I have been working on for over a year now, is it's scattered all over the federal government. And it involves very deeply the private sector. 85% of the critical infrastructure in America is owned and run by the private sector. So it's not something the government can do all by itself. And the structure right now is chaotic. There are leaders in 4, 5, 6 different federal agencies. You've got private sector groups that work on cybersecurity, but there's no overall coordination. So one of our focuses of our commission was, how do we bring some sensible, coherent organization to this process? So if there is, number one, to better plan, number two, to better design a strategy, and number three, to better cope with a crisis if it occurs. I mean, and as you know, we're working on this idea of a national cyber director, and there's some resistance to that in the White House. I keep contending this is a favor to the president, because if there's a cyber attack, the one thing the president doesn't want is 5 people pointing at each other. Oh no, it's not my responsibility. That's theirs. That's the Navy, or that's Homeland Security should have done that. I think you need one person who has the accountability that the president can say, this is your baby. You get up every morning and I want you worrying about cyber and how we defend ourselves and how we recover if there's an attack. How do we prevent an attack, but how do we also recover? So that to me is sort of, I'm not a student of organizational politics, but you've got to have accountability. You've got to have some clear lines of authority, and that's where we came out on the commission.
Single throat to choke.
That's it. One throat to choke. That was my motto in business.
And you were, though raised in a family of New Deal Democrats, you were an Eisenhower fan, or are an Eisenhower fan, correct?
Yeah. In fact, my dad took me to Eisenhower's first inauguration in 1952. I was 8 years old. We stood out on Pennsylvania Avenue and watched the parade go by. My parents sort of liked Eisenhower. They weren't crazy about Nixon, I have to tell you. But I think Eisenhower,
had inauguration on my wall over
there
here.
You go.
I wasn't.
Yeah. I was there, but I think Eisenhower, and you know more about it than I do, but Eisenhower grows in the estimation of historians with each passing year. He was a very smart guy and had a great intuitive sense of organization and leadership. And what was it? You said something on the hearing today. He said, "Oh, I'm quoting
not
Gallagher now.
Silence.
Yeah, no dissent by silence. If you don't speak up, you're out of the picture."
What also I think is related to your point about accountability. I mean, Eisenhower wanted everybody to sort of, sound off and say where they stood, and then, have clear lines of authority.
I don't want to get into, day-to-day politics, but I'm a huge believer in having people around you who disagree with you. Nobody gets it right all the time. In fact, I have a friend in Maine who has a sign in his office in his company that says, "All of us are always smarter than any of us." And I think that's a very perceptive comment. And I've found that. And so I have people on my staff, one of them, Steve Smith, who doesn't hesitate in the slightest when telling me when I'm wrong and when I'm missing something or I haven't understood something thoroughly. I think that's critically important. And I frankly think it's one of the things that has hampered President Trump is that he doesn't take well to criticism, and you need people, and also you need a peer. My chief of staff was a woman named Kay Rand, who'd been with me for 25 years. She was chief of staff as governor and for the first 6 years in the Senate, and she wasn't the least bit intimidated by me or by the position. She was a peer. In fact, when I first became governor, we all took these personality tests, She scored 0 on the respect for authority scale. And that's what you want. You want somebody who's going to say, "Hey, man, you're out to lunch here," because otherwise all of us are going to make mistakes. And so that's one of my strongest sort of principles. I used to teach this, Mike, before between governor and senator. I taught at Bowdoin College and Bates College a course called Leaders and Leadership, where I really dug into these kinds of issues. And one of the most important ones is to have people around you that differ from you.
Well, I'd like to connect that to current politics. Because I mean, you talked earlier about, parties going further to each side of the ideological spectrum. And I wonder if those things aren't connected, right? I mean, we seem to, if you're conservative, you're viewing the world through one prism, right? It's a Fox News prism that reinforces your pre-existing worldview. If you're a liberal, you can do the same. Social media has intensified that. I think it's hard to find, and part of the reason I value our friendship so much, it's hard to find fora in which you can have respectful disagreement or debate anymore.
Well, but one of the problems is that our primary system, particularly if it's a gerrymandered district, favors the extreme, whether it's Democratic or Republican. And you can be in trouble. I'm so glad you asked that question. I think the most dangerous thing in American politics today is that you can lose an election because you're reasonable. If you're seen as a person who's willing to compromise on either side, Republican or Democratic, in an effort to get things done, that in itself will be used against you in a campaign. He's not strong enough standing up to those Democrats. Or, I mean, remember, I don't know if you recall, but in the presidential campaign, Biden got hammered early on by talking about how he could work with Republicans and talking about his experience in the Senate. He got clobbered in the Democratic primaries. He recovered from it, but it was a sin to talk about working with the other side. Mike, if that becomes the norm, we're sunk, because human endeavor requires compromise. Mary and I compromise all the time. I say, yes, I agree. No, if she sees this, she'll kill me for saying that. But seriously, you know what I mean. I mean, and it's particularly dangerous in a gerrymandered district where the primary is the election.
Yeah.
Because that pushes you to the extreme of your party, whichever it is, and. I was reading about a Republican primary somewhere. I won't mention where it was, but each candidate is trying to prove they're further to the right and more pro-Trump than the other, and they're just hammering each other. And that produces, and the same thing happens in a New York liberal district that's 80% Democrat. You're going to get the more liberal candidate is going to win, because that's who votes in the primary. It's the activists. Also, it's a dangerous trend.
It's interesting that people are defining it on, your measure of conservatism is just how loyal you are to the president, regardless of whether the president happens to support a policy that might not be conservative at that point. Right. Which shows you how scrambled things have gotten, and I think there's a version of that on the left too.
No question.
I wonder too. I mean, you also have this interesting thing related to campaign finance, where we're seeing now a lot of, and it's not just a Democrat thing, but I'll just use this as an example. Like the DCCC will start meddling in a Republican primary to attack the more moderate candidate in order to elevate the crazy candidate.
Yeah.
And I'm sure the reverse happens too. All sorts of shenanigans. I mean, do you see campaign finance dysfunction as related to this too?
Yeah, I do. I mean, the biggest problem with campaign finance is lack of accountability, lack of disclosure. I think constitutionally it's hard. I mean, we have limits about, how much you can contribute, and they've stood the test. But then we have these dark money groups that are unlimited. Somebody, if I contribute $100 to your reelection campaign, you've got to disclose my name, address, occupation, all of that stuff. It's in your disclosure form. If I form a super PAC called, Wisconsinites for Green Grass, I can put in $4 or $5 million personally, if I had it, and put ads on TV in your campaign without any accountability. The people of Wisconsin would not know, have no way of knowing that it was me, because there's no requirement to disclose. And I think, in Maine, we still have town meetings. You can't go to a town meeting with a bag over your head. Your identity is part of your message. But that's where we are. And disclosure used to be a bipartisan issue. It is no longer. Citizens United, the famous Citizens United said, well, we don't have to worry about a lot of money screwing up the political system because there'll be disclosure. Well, Congress has never taken up that invitation from the Supreme Court to do the disclosure. So that's one of the problems. And Mike, just the amount of money is ridiculous. I mean, in the Senate race in New Hampshire 2 years ago, Maggie Hassan and Kelly Ayotte, these two states, New Hampshire, 1.3 million people, $130 million was spent. The two candidates raised 15 apiece, which is a lot of money. That's 30. The other 100 all came from the outside. And it, almost impossible. When I ran in 12, there were national organizations spending money. They spent $6 or $7 million against me. They didn't do much for them, but and it was all but impossible to determine where that money actually came from. I just don't think that's healthy.
We also have people doing funny things with disclosure requirements that do exist. They'll sort of game the timing where, they don't have to disclose until the primaries already happened or something like that.
Right. But I want to go back to the point. I really think, Mike, that if we're in a place where you can lose an election because your opponent charges you with being reasonable and looking for solutions, that's really dangerous for the country, I think, because we end up not being able to solve problems.
So if you were king for a day, pun intended, you've been king for many days. Wait, can you tell your story about America doesn't need a king? What was that?
Oh, well, it was during the impeachment trial. It was during the impeachment trial, and everybody, in the trial was talking about, we don't want a king, and we don't want a king as president. I mean, this was, Adam Schiff and all these guys. So one night, we finished at about 9:30 or 10 at night, and they gavelled, the Chief Justice gavelled the thing over, it was closed. And I stood up and said, I'm tired of people saying a king can't be president. It was a rare light moment, I can tell you, in that process.
So if you were king for a day, though, are there an obvious set of 2 or 3 reforms, like policy agnostic reforms, that you think could get the institutions working again? I mean, you maybe suggested just the schedule change would be one of them.
Well, that would be one of them. I think if people had their families here and if they stayed here and got to know one another, that would help. That seems silly to talk about something like schedule, but there it is. By the way, I decided after I'd been here about 6 months and saw this, that I was going to have my own little campaign to do something about it. So I'm in my little 908 square foot house over here on the about 6 blocks east of the Capitol. There's a rib joint up the street 2 blocks away. So until COVID came, about every 6 weeks, my office would call around to the Senate and call until we got 4 or 5 senators, always bipartisan, to come, and I'd pick up ribs, beans, and coleslaw on the way, and we just have dinner to just talk, just to get to know each other. And at one of our dinners, Mike, there were 2 senators sitting next to each other, and one of them looked over at me in the middle of dinner and said, I've seen this guy around here for 8 years, and this is the first time we've ever talked. Holy smoke, no wonder it doesn't work. So yeah, that's one. But more seriously, disclosure of campaign finance, I think, would be important. And finally, getting rid of gerrymandering, because then every congressional district would be competitive. They wouldn't be all Republican or all Democratic. And gerrymandering is a non-denominational problem. And to have districts be, contiguous and rational shape and size, and then you have people running toward the middle instead of people running for the edges. Those would be a couple of things that I think would be helpful.
I wondered if we're saying, and I say gerrymandering too, so this isn't criticism. Are we saying gerrymandering wrong? Because was it not Elbridge Gerry that we're referring to? Shouldn't it be gerrymandering? I mean, you knew, man. What was he like?
Okay, I'll let that pass. But the original gerrymander was a House district in Massachusetts that on the map it looked like a salamander. It stretched, from, I don't know, Pittsfield to Boston. It was this long, skinny, odd-looking thing, and there was a cartoon in the press, and they called it a gerrymander because it looked like an animal of some kind, named for Elbridge Gerry. I don't know if he deserved that to have this name attached to this for 200 years of American history. But yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah.
I'll edit that out. I got a whole team.
I can tell you Jefferson was really a nice guy. We talked.
I have one more serious question, and I want to end on some more lighthearted stuff. And I know I've gone over time, so hopefully I'll bring it to a close here to be respectful. But one area where I think we have an opportunity to restore a little bit of bipartisanship is when it comes to China policy, and you've been a really forceful voice on that. I'm just curious if you agree that that's.
It is. China policy is a something where I think there is a lot of room for bipartisan. I have praise and criticism for the president. You'll be surprised. My praise is confronting China was necessary. My criticism is we shouldn't have tried to do it by ourselves. We should have done it with allies. The president should have worked with Europe, with NATO, with the EU, with Latin America. Everybody has a China problem. And by trying to go it alone, it hasn't worked. And China, in fact, is going around our back and making deals with all these other countries around the world, setting up bases and selling them Huawei equipment and all those kinds of things. So my belief is we need to have a coherent China policy, but it needs to be multilateral instead of unilateral. I went to a defense conference in Singapore a couple of years ago and had a whole lot of meetings with small, with different countries. The big meetings weren't all that good, but I have what they call bilateral meetings with people from Japan and Thailand and Singapore and all these different places. What I learned was America has allies and friends. China has clients. They don't have and neither do the Russians. They don't have people that want to work with them the way we do. And we're squandering a major asset by not reaching out more to allies. But deeper, Mike, we've got to figure out how to live with China. We've got to figure out how to come to some way of competing without it leading to conflict. A guy named Graham Allison at Harvard wrote a book called The Thucydides Trap. Thucydides was a Greek historian, and Allison analyzed 16 cases where you had a rising power and an established power throughout world history, going back to the Athens and Sparta. That was Thucydides. In 12 of those 16 cases, it ended in war. Rising power, China. Established power, US. We've really got to have some deep thought and relationship building to try to figure out a way to compete with China without it leading to conflict, which would be catastrophic for both societies. I don't know how to do that. I think it's something we need to understand what they want. They need to understand what we want. We have to have a better dialogue with them. If I were president, I'd learn Mandarin so I could talk.
But King can't be president.
Face.
We've covered this.
I know. So I could talk. Yeah, right. No king can be president. But so we could understand. I have this feeling we've got these two giants lumbering toward a confrontation that neither side wants, but each passing day seems to make more and more inevitable, and that it really worries me. It worries me the danger of an accidental conflict. Some cowboy Chinese pilot rams into a U.S. ship in the South China Sea, and before we know it, we're into a real dangerous confrontation. It takes some serious diplomacy and serious deep thinking, and I'll leave that to you because you're a much deeper thinker than I am.
Well, and if my tens of listeners want to know how we can do that in the cyber domain, they can read the report that you and I spent a year writing together. Okay, so let's close on some more fun questions. I mean, you obviously are a voracious reader. Do you read fiction in addition to history and nonfiction?
It's funny you should say that because Mary keeps saying, read a novel. Not much. Every now and then, I do most of my reading now on Audible, online. I'm in the middle of a wonderful Stephen Fry complete Sherlock Holmes.
Oh, wow.
Which is really great. And I listen to that most evenings as a break. It just takes you into an entirely different world, which is good. But most of my reading is I'm reading the Innovators, Walter Isaacson. I do some history. I just finished the Grant book, the new Ron Chernow biography of Grant, which is fascinating. Wow. I found the second half about his presidency actually more interesting than the Civil War part because I didn't know anything about it.
Did Joshua Chamberlain ever write a book
Oh,
or?
Lord, he wrote all kinds of books. He wrote, in fact, I think I've got one right
I
here.
feel like I just insulted Maine. That was like
There it
saying,
is.
never do
It's called The Passing of the Armies, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Chamberlain was a genius. He spoke 10 languages.
Wow.
He was a professor at Bowdoin when he went into the war and was a absolutely brilliant guy and a great writer. There's a story in here about he was chosen by Grant to literally accept the surrender of the Southern Army at Appomattox, to be the officer where the Southern Army came and laid down their arms. And Chamberlain has a description of that in here that's absolutely lyrical to describe that moment. And he did something remarkable at that moment. He ordered his men to salute when the Southern Army came. It was very controversial. People in the North went nuts, but he called it honor answering honor. He hated the cause, but he honored the bravery of the Southern soldiers that were putting their flags down and putting their arms down. And it was one of the things that contributed to the Civil War not deteriorating into a guerrilla war, which it could have. Grant also gave generous terms to the Lee at Appomattox. And if you think about it, the Civil War could have dragged on into the 20th century if the Southerners had gone back. In fact, it almost did. The Ku Klux Klan was a sort of Southern army, and Grant squashed it when he was president. It's one of his greatest achievements. In fact, what I said to somebody, Grant won the Civil War twice. But anyway, yeah, Chamberlain was a great writer. Aren't you sorry you asked?
No, that's fascinating. And you could connect it with fiction with Killer Angels by Michael Cera has Chamberlain as a great character. What about lowbrow? Do you movies, TV, when you can't all be history?
Well, I'm an NFL fanatic. I mean, I love football. I love watching the NFL. I've gotten to the point where I cringe a little bit about the violence and the head injuries, but I love the game. It's a fabulous game. That's my desired outcome. I'm a Harley guy. I've got a Harley in my garage in Brunswick, Maine. I've been riding motorcycles for 50 years. In fact, I just posted an Instagram. One of my things is Instagram, Angus King, Maine. That's my promotion. But I just posted last Thursday an Instagram of me on the Harley a few years ago in my campaign for the Senate, and me on a 1951 German Army surplus BMW in Hungary in 1966. I traveled by motorcycle for the summer of 1966, all behind the Iron Curtain.
Wow.
Where they'd never seen Americans. It was an amazing. So you ought to check it out. I got these two pictures of the Harley and of me in a field somewhere in Hungary. I think it's Hungary or Czechoslovakia, on that old BMW I bought for $90 in Munich in the summer of '66. And the other thing I love to do is I really like RVing. Mary and I, as I say, just bought a new one a couple of weeks ago, and it's just a great lifestyle. I love the people and going into places we haven't been before. It's fun.
That's great. So, okay. Final question: when you next come to Green Bay for a Packers game, and we're having a beer before the game, and a kid from Northeast Wisconsin comes up to us and says, "Senator King, I listened to you on Mike Gallagher's podcast. I'm a huge fan of your work. I'm thinking about, a career like yours, which is a mix of different things and public service. What advice would you have for that young Northeast Wisconsinite?"
Oh, man. I think I'd have the same advice the old man gave me. See that you regret the things you did and not the things you didn't do.
Wow.
Also, advice. I have I've been giving the same high school graduation speech since 1992. It's changed somewhat, but the title of the speech is 10 Things I Wish Somebody Had Told Me When I Was 18. And that's part of it. Number one is take more risks. I'm not going to give you the whole speech, but take more risks, take chances. People, I think, hold themselves back more than anything else. There's this little man on our shoulder that says, "You can't do that." Well, you can, and so what? You know, Wayne Gretzky says I miss 100% of the shots I don't take. You know, so anyway, that I think that's my advice to the kid would be go for it. You know, and don't feel restrained. You know, if you know you're guys like you and I mean, my dad was a lawyer, yes, but my parents weren't upper class by any means. They didn't have a great deal of money, and I walk into that building with that big dome on it over there, and I say, holy smoke, do I really? How did I get here? And I'm sure you feel the same way. I mean, you sort of pinch yourself, the opportunity that we've been given, and I'm just determined to make the most of it and try to do some good for the country, as I know you are.
Well, that's great advice to end on. Senator Angus King, thank you for taking the time, and thanks for putting up with me for over a year. And I always enjoy our conversations, and really appreciate your service to this country.
Well, I feel like I've talked too much, but you made the mistake of asking questions. But I got to tell you, Mike, getting to know you and working with you over this past year and a half or so has been one of the great pleasures of my life. I mean, I think what we've accomplished in that report is meaningful, and it will stand the test of time. And who knows, it may even be important in protecting our country. So working with you, I'll never forget the first time I met you. Somebody started reading off your resume and your education and Marine Corps and everything. I don't know if you remember, but I stood up and said, I'm out of here. I'm not going to even try to compete with this guy. But I have such admiration for what you're doing. Congratulations on the new baby. How's she doing?
She's doing great. She's growing every single day. And
you read her the Constitution each night before you go to bed?
Just read her the captions on your Instagram account.
Oh, that's it. Yeah. Here's the Constitution right here on the tie, by the way. Can you see "We the People"?
With the tie that's not a lobster tie, I guess the Constitution tie outranks lobsters.
Well, I left, to be truthful, I left my red lobster tie in Maine when I came down this trip. So my red tie is the Constitution tie. And you know what it says? It says "We the People," but it also says the election will be November 3rd.
I love it. Thank you, Senator Angus King.
See you, man. Thank you.
The dude